in charge of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park.
Well, that's not what you told me yesterday.
Oh, I'm one of the directors of the agency. For those of you who haven't heard of the Great Barrier Reef, it's a very large MPA. It's a federal run MPA that starts at low water mark on the Queensland coast, and it stretches out to about 250 kilometres offshore. It's extremely long in terms of length, over 2,300 kilometres in length. So within this area of 345,000 square kilometres, it's a very, very large marine protected area. We've got within that about 3,000 separate coral reefs and about 900 islands. This is a satellite image. It just shows a very small part of the Great Barrier Reef. You can see in the dotted part on the map the area that's shown. And the satellite image makes it very clear that there are separate coral reefs, but they're basically relatively close inshore, and the boundary of the Great Barrier Reef is, in this case, the closest. It's about 80 kilometres offshore. So we're talking about a huge area, and a lot of it is more than just coral reefs. In fact, only about 7% of the area within the marine park is actually coral reefs. We have huge areas that are non-coral reefs, inter-reef areas. About 60% is up to 200 metres in depth, and then the over 30% is actually in deep water, so between 200 and 2,000 metres depth. A very small proportion within the World Heritage Area is actually islands. There are, as I said, 900 islands. Only some of those are actually managed by the Commonwealth. Most of them are managed by the state. So the Great Barrier Reef is really not a very typical marine protected area. It's not typical in terms of its size or its complexity. But I think what we've learnt over the last 35 years, I think has a lot of useful lessons for people elsewhere, particularly in terms of moving towards ecosystem-based management. But also if you're moving towards just MPA management or even coastal zone management, there are lessons I think can be learnt. So the park has always been set up as a multiple use park. Since 1975, when the legislation was brought into effect, they've always had the objective of having multiple use somewhere throughout the Great Barrier Reef. So here you can see a list of what we call reasonable activities are allowed. Certain activities are not allowed. So an unreasonable activity is oil drilling or any sort of mining. Those are totally prohibited throughout the Great Barrier Reef. But virtually all other reasonable activities are allowed to occur somewhere within different zones. And so people are amazed in a marine protected area and also in a World Heritage Area, we've got things like bottom trawling. We've got activities like defence training using high explosives. We've got activities like dredging. These are all allowed to occur, not throughout the entire area, but in certain zones, and often with very strict controls and often requiring an environmental impact assessment before they're allowed to occur. So if we look at what we see the advantages of a multiple use approach, basically we say if you manage the whole area in an integrated way, it's got a lot of benefits over managing just very small isolated islands if they're surrounded by lots of damaging activities. For example, if you've got a very small MPA and all around is being fished or all around is being polluted, that little MPA in time is not going to be viable. So we see broad area integrated management as being much more effective ecologically, practically and socially. Lots of advantages for taking that integrated broad area approach. The Great Barrier Reef is worth an awful lot of money to the Australian government and the Queensland government. They estimate, just looking at the direct activities, primarily tourism and fishing, about $5 billion Australian per annum. And the Australian dollar is about US, equivalent to the US dollar these days. So it is worth a lot of money. But there's a lot of other things that are not valued in that equation. We haven't put any value on the ecosystem, or particularly the ecosystem services. But like marine areas right around the world, the Great Barrier Reef is under pressure. Even though we believe it's well managed and well looked after, these are the sort of pressures that are not just unique to the Great Barrier Reef. These are the sorts of pressures that are happening right around the world, and we've seen some of these in our last few days here in Costa Rica. Things like the impacts of water quality downstream, the impacts of increasing coastal development, increasing fishing effort and the impacts of that increasing effort, increase in shipping and shipping incidents, increase in recreation and tourism, and lastly, the big one is climate change. And climate change is happening right now. We're seeing impacts of climate change in the Great Barrier Reef. We've seen increased coral bleaching, and we're certainly aware of the problems of down the track of increasing acidification. So I want to stress, when we're talking about marine conservation, we're talking about a lot more than just marine protected areas. To me, and what we've learned in the Great Barrier Reef, if we want to get effective marine conservation, we need to think about regulating land-based and maritime sources of pollution, but particularly in our case, land-based pollution. We need to think about regulating the use of the marine environment, in particular fisheries, but if we're talking about any sort of collection or sand mining, those sorts of things, or sand extraction, we need to think about having effective marine protected areas, or particularly the no-take aspect of MPAs. But the fourth key one is also having what we call integrated coastal zone and ocean management. And when I use the word integrated here, I'm really saying it's integrated in a whole lot of ways. Integrated across governments. So all jurisdictions are thinking about working together. The adjacent waters, both state and federal. We're thinking about integrated across agencies. This needs great coordination, but in our way, it's the only way we can manage such a large area. We need to have integration across the land and water interface. This is not just thinking about the wet bits or the area that we're responsible. Our jurisdiction stops at low water, but we have to think outside our jurisdiction up onto the land. We need to think in terms of across sectors, intersectoral, between the different user groups, how they can work together. We need to think about the different disciplines. So this isn't just about ecology. This is as much about social and economic and cultural. And the last important part of integration is the intergenerational integration. So if we're really going to do integrated coastal and ocean zone management effectively, we need to try and think of all these aspects of integration. So how do we do it in the Great Barrier Reef? This is a huge area, bigger than many countries. Basically, the management is conducted through a great deal of coordination between both federal and state agencies. The entire Great Barrier Reef is adjacent to just one state, the state of Queensland. So we're lucky from that perspective. But within that one state, we have many agencies who are responsible for marine activities. So, for example, the Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service are mainly responsible for the environment and national parks, but they do an awful lot in the marine environment for us. We have the Boating and Fisheries Patrol, the Water Police, and then a whole series of federal agencies. So say, for example, every day there are boats and aircraft somewhere in the marine park. But my agency, the Federal Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, we don't own a single aircraft, and we don't today own a single boat. Our job is to coordinate all these other agencies working effectively together in an integrated way to manage the reef. One of the key tools we use, and I stress it's only one tool, is ocean zoning. This, as I have mentioned to others in the workshop the last few days, has been part of our approach to management since 1975. If you look at the different coloured zones, the light blue zone is the least restrictive. This is what we call the general use zone and allows all reasonable activities. And as you move across from the light blue, the dark blue, the yellow, right across to the pink zone, the pink zone is what Steve was talking about. That's a no entry area. It's effectively called a preservation zone. And as a manager, I can't even go into that zone unless I have a permit. And the only reason I can get a permit is if I'm doing research that cannot be done anywhere else in the marine park. And that research also has to be for benefit for management. So those little scientific baseline areas are really important for us to assess the rest of the management of the Great Barrier Reef. So we've applied this zoning tool since the early 80s. And over a series of different zoning plans application, we developed a plan that looks like this. By the late 1990s, there were 7 types of marine zones. There's actually one island zone, but I haven't shown that there. 7 types